Well, first, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, General Cousin and Professor Sejak, for inviting me to this event. It really is an honor and a privilege to be here to join with fellow airmen, as well as students of this important topic, to address the potential of air power in meeting our collective security needs. Especially this audience who have the knowledge, the insight, and appreciation for the value of air and space power as a critical element of both national and allied security. Now, also, John, please tell me if I'm speaking too fast or too slow.
Perfect.
Just right?
Perfect pace, yeah.
Okay, a little slow for me, but I will try to keep it at this pace so that those of you who are getting a translation can hear. I very much appreciate the invitation to share my thoughts with you about multi-domain operations, Mosaic Warfare, and the future of aerospace power in an age of uncertainty. Given all the trauma in the world today, I thought I would first offer you a summary of my perspectives on the emerging security environment, then my view of the relevance of multi-domain operations, how aerospace power fits in that environment, and how we might reconcile our security aspirations by embracing a concept of operations based on information age capabilities. We all face a complex series of security challenges today that will shape the circumstances of how and what armed forces will be used in the future. First, our defense strategies must contend with an economic and military powerhouse in China, an aggressive Russia, declining states, some with nuclear weapons, the increasing likelihood of nuclear weapons proliferation, and evil actors of the most despicable nature exemplified by a dynamic web of terrorism. Second, the pace and tenor of our lives have been irrevocably altered by the acceleration of change. Global trade, travel, and telecommunications have produced major shifts in the way we live. Speed and complexity have merged and now permeate the conduct of warfare. Consequently, one implication for our future militaries is that they must be able to respond rapidly anywhere on the globe. General Cousin mentioned this in his introductory remarks about the importance to be able to act and operate outside one's sovereign borders. Third, we have to contend with increasing costs and limited budgets for defense. Therefore, the provision of flexibility of response across a wide spectrum of circumstances should be foremost among the decision criteria we apply to our future militaries. Fourth, in the information age, we have to acknowledge that deploying large numbers, not working? That better? Did you miss everything I said so far? Okay. Fourth, in the information age, we have to acknowledge that deploying large numbers of boots on the ground onto foreign soil to nation build instead of accomplishing a mission and leaving are simply counterproductive to achieving critical security goals and objectives. Fifth, we must actively pursue and invest in options we can use to counter the increasingly advanced access denial strategies our adversaries are likely to employ. Sixth, we need to challenge our adversaries' domination of public perception. We have to learn how to use accurate information as a core element of our security apparatus. We are woefully inept at strategic communications, and that needs to change. Finally, information's value also extends past the news cycle. Just as wireless connectivity, personal computing devices, and cloud-based applications are revolutionizing life in the civilian sector, these trends will also radically alter the way our military forces must operate to succeed. Faster and more capable networks and computing capabilities are turning information into the dominant factor in modern warfare. We need to understand.
In France, even the microphones are on strike. Okay, so
Switch out.
I take this one.
All right, how's this? Can you still hear me up there in the back? Okay, very good. Faster and more capable networks and computing capabilities are turning information into the dominant factor in modern warfare. We need to understand that modern aircraft will be valued as information machines far beyond being simply platforms that deliver weapons. Given this reality, it's time we acknowledge that information and its management is just as important today as are the traditional tools of military power. Information and data are the forces evolving these tools, airplanes, satellites, infantry, and warships, from isolated systems into an integrated enterprise where the exchange of data and its accurate interpretation will determine success or failure. How do our air forces relate to all of these operating conditions? Well, first, I will tell you right up front that while I've spent my entire adult life as an airman, I believe that if peace-loving nations are going to retain our roles as forces for good across the planet, that we need to have strong armies, navies, and air forces in each of our militaries. The spectrum of capabilities provided by individual service components can then be integrated to meet the needs of a particular contingency. This is the value of jointness, using the right force at the right place at the right time. This is the essence of the term multi-domain operations. In reality, this is a new label that describes an evolution of warfare. First, there was warfare on the ground, then at sea, then from the air. Space became an operating domain in the middle of the last century, and cyber toward the end of it. In the United States, the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 was a step toward realization of the benefits of greater integration of operations across each of these domains. And now, multi-domain terminology is a maturing of that realization in order to optimize our warfighting capabilities. So today, we need to reach beyond interoperability to achieve interdependency among the domains to exploit the advantages of each in a highly integrated fashion. With respect to multi-domain operations, let me characterize our Air Force's role in that context. Air forces are at the forefront of multi-domain operations because of our operating perspective. We routinely operate with a global and operational or theater-wide perspective, as well as at the tactical level. Our space operators circle the globe every 90 minutes. Our airmen fly across the width of a deployed Army division in 90 seconds. And our cyber warriors operate at the speed of light. We do that today and will continue doing it in the future, but even to better effect because that is our mission. And we will continue to hone our skills to optimize our performance given advances in technology. Now, our sister services possess aircraft and operate in space and cyberspace. But the air, space, and cyber elements of armies and navies are rightfully dedicated to facilitating the core functions of their parent service, operations on the ground or at sea. We have air forces as separate and distinct services in our respective nations. They are not just another air arm, like the air arms of our navies and armies, but rather our air forces are specifically dedicated and structured to exploit the advantages of operating in the third dimension of air and space. It is this unique and specific focus that keeps our nations on the leading edge of the challenges we face, or in other words, makes aerospace power one of our key asymmetric advantages. So the term multi-domain operations is one that describes a growing realization of the importance of the interdependency of operations in every domain, not simply interoperability. We must move towards cross-domain synergy, embracing complementary, vice merely additive employment of multi-domain capabilities that enhances effectiveness and compensates for the individual vulnerabilities that do exist in each of the domains. Desired military effects will increasingly be generated by the interaction of systems that share information and empower one another. This phenomena is not restricted to an individual technology, nor is it isolated to a specific service, domain, or task. What is absolutely fundamental to this degree of interdependency is the notion of the seamless and ubiquitous sharing of information. This concept is one that I've been advocating and writing about for many years and can be envisioned as a combat cloud, an operating paradigm where information, data management, connectivity, and command and control are core mission priorities. This idea of a combat cloud treats every platform as a sensor as well as an effector. And it will require a command and control paradigm enabling automatic linking, seamless data transfer capabilities, all the while being reliable, secure, and jam-proof. The combat cloud inverts the paradigm of combined arms warfare, making information the focal point, not the operational domains. This concept represents an evolution where individually networked platforms in any domain transform into a system of systems enterprise, integrated by domain and mission agnostic linkages. Mosaic is a force design concept for this kind of systems warfare strategy. The concept of the Mosaic Warfare is designed to address the demands of the future strategic environment as well as the shortcomings of the current force. Mosaic Warfare exploits both the ability of advanced networks to seamlessly share information across an area of operations, as well as recent developments in processing, computing, and networking. Functional capabilities, such as radar, fire control, and missiles that once had to be hosted on a common platform, like a sophisticated combat aircraft, can now be disaggregated into their smallest practical elements. In the Mosaic concept, platforms are decomposed into these smallest practical functions, creating collaborative nodes in a networked kill web that is highly resilient and can remain operationally effective, even if an adversary effectively attacks and eliminates some of the web's elements. Mosaic warfare is a concept of operations that uses highly resilient networks of redundant nodes and multiple kill paths to minimize the critical system value of allied nodes that an enemy could target. This ensures allied forces are effective even in contested environments. At the same time, disaggregated functionality would allow a Mosaic force to be highly adaptable across the spectrum of military operations. Mosaic combines the attributes of highly capable, high-end systems with the volume and agility afforded by numerous smaller force elements that could be arranged into many different configurations or presentations. So please don't misinterpret me in my remarks on Mosaic. This isn't about eliminating the systems and capabilities we already have. It's using them in conjunction with new technologies that would allow us to rapidly reorganize a particular set of capabilities to accomplish different functions. When composed together, these smaller elements complete operational observe, orient, decide, and act cycles. This is the familiar OODA loops and kill chains. Like Lego blocks, I presume they have Lego blocks in Europe. Good. I was concerned about that analogy. But like Lego blocks that near universally fit together, Mosaic forces can be composed together in a way to create packages that can effectively target an adversary's system with enough overmatch to succeed. The Mosaic force design concept is more than just an information architecture. Mosaic offers a comprehensive model for systems warfare that encompasses requirements and acquisition processes, the creation of operational concepts, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and force presentations and force allocation action in addition to combat operations. So Mosaic is not simply about quickly closing kill chains. The attributes of a Mosaic force design can help increase the speed of action across the Allied warfighting enterprise, whether it involves quickly responding to urgent new requirements, integrating innovative and out-of-cycle capabilities, or operational planning. The guiding principles and technologies that underpin a Mosaic force design will help us to prevail in long-term competitions with great power adversaries. Implementing a Mosaic force design will challenge current issues of doctrine, tradition, parochialism, bureaucratic fiefdoms, and even the pride of victories past. Nonetheless, the traditional way of war must adopt if it is to meet the challenges of information age warfare in the 21st century. To migrate to a Mosaic force design, the following areas of development are prerequisites that will require additional investment and smart oversight. 1, automated technology that can share information across different security levels. I think everyone here would agree that continues to be a problem. 2, appropriate policies for test, validation, and verification of artificial intelligence. 3, multiple and complementary approaches to spoof-proofing artificial intelligence. 4, commitment to current force structure and programs of record. As I mentioned earlier, this whole notion of Mosaic is not, hey, let's throw everything we have out and start with something new. That's unrealistic, not pragmatic. It's adapting where we are today to capitalize on technologies and information to move into the future. 5, operationally focused cost assessment of force design alternatives. 6, aggressive investment in developing and fielding Mosaic enablers. And 7, experimenting with Mosaic operational concepts, architectures, and empowered command and control at the edge or forward elements of the battle space. There are many trends that already indicate the value and potential of this kind of Mosaic approach to operations. Early examples of systems, technologies, software, and architectures that are Mosaic in nature are already being developed or fielded. Indeed, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the services have been investing in maturing many of the Mosaic enablers that they have already identified. Mosaic-type operations are not new to our air forces, and our air forces are perhaps the best candidates to take the lead role in our militaries for developing a Mosaic force design concept that could reshape planning, processes, force structure, and how we execute our multi-domain operations. Since it is the collective of our allied militaries that backstops the political grand strategy of any alliance, we must out-adapt adversaries who have and who will continue to adapt to our obsolescing current force designs. That said, we can migrate to more effective forces even as new elements are introduced to make them more effective in character and operational concept. What cannot migrate is resistance to a new way of war. What I've been talking about, this idea of Mosaic force design. Within defense culture, largely conditioned by an atypical era of absolute military dominance, permissive threat environments, and a lack of peer adversaries. Swift decisions are needed to align thinking and resources to the enablers of Mosaic warfare. Now, Mosaic warfare, enabled by the combat cloud as an operating paradigm, will require an entirely different methodology for the command and control of air power, along with the weapons and forces operating in the other domains. Command and control must keep up with the changes imposed by 3 major interrelated trends. 1, emerging threats. 2, new technologies. And 3, the increasing velocity of information. The changes in these 3 areas since the design and establishment of our current air and space operations centers have been dramatic. So much so that as a result of modern telecommunications and the ability to rapidly transmit information to, from, and between various levels of command, there are many examples of information age operations where tactical level decisions were usurped by commanders at the operational and even strategic levels. In fact, after Desert Storm, or the First Gulf War, most air power engagement decisions that involve lethal force have been pushed to the highest levels of command. This has occurred for a variety of reasons and worthy of a book, but I'll get to the point. The devolution of the air power command and control tenet of centralized control, decentralized execution, into one of centralized control, centralized execution, has caused reduced effectiveness in accomplishing air power mission objectives. Recall, this was the Soviet construct of command and control. And while it might work in permissive airspace, in small-scale operations, in contested airspace, in large-scale operations, it is sure to fail. Commanders must discipline themselves to operate at their respective command levels if air power is to realize its potential in the future. The challenges of emerging threats, information velocity, and advanced technologies demand more than a mere evolution of current command and control paradigms, but rather a new approach that capitalizes on the opportunities inherent in those same challenges. We cannot expect to achieve future success through incremental enhancements to current command and control structures. That method evokes an industrial age approach that has lost its currency and much of its meaning. The requirements of information age warfare demand not spiral development, but modular, distributed technological maximization that permits and optimizes operational agility. That kind of agility will not be achieved without dramatic changes to our current air power command and control concepts of operation. In order to capitalize on the advantages of moving to the distributed paradigm of the combat cloud, we must move toward distributed command and control and shift to an evolved version of the centralized control, decentralized execution model to one of centralized command, distributed control, and decentralized execution. I will leave the details for another presentation, but suffice it to say that command and control of air power is fundamental to its success, and it must be adopted to become more agile and rapid if Mosaic Warfare is to be optimized to its fullest potential. So, how do our air forces fit into this future? A little bit of history. In the early 1900s, pioneers of aviation sought freedom from many of the restrictions burdened by their peers. They slipped the surely bonds of Earth to introduce to the world a new power, air power. This past July, the French Air Force celebrated its 85th anniversary as an independent Air Force. The U.S. Air Force celebrated its 70th anniversary as an independent service just a few years ago. It was in August of 1907 that the first U.S. military organization was formed with a specific focus on air power. That organization was the Aeronautical Division of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. It was the precursor of today's U.S. Air Force, and at the time, it had exactly 10 balloons that were used to conduct reconnaissance, the equivalent of modern-day intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, if you will. In 1908, they acquired their first dirigible and a trial airplane. And in 1909, the U.S. Army purchased an improved Wright Flyer that was formally inducted into service, and they named it Airplane Number 1. This is the kind of creativity the United States Army is still known for today. Thank you for getting my joke. Joking aside, it's impressive to note that it was only 4 years after the first documented flight of a manned aircraft in 1903 that air power's military potential was formally recognized with the establishment of that first flying unit in 1907. That's the kind of forward thinking, of pushing the envelope, and of advancing established boundaries that's been the hallmark of military air power and of airmen ever since. It occurred because pioneers with a vision for the potential of air power that was yet within reach strongly advocated for, and I need another microphone. What, the batteries going dead or what? I guess that means I'm talking too long. Today, air power technology has caught up with and to a degree bypassed early air power theory, and the potential exists to dramatically expand the effects of air power as a means to achieve security goals and objectives. To do that, however, will require the same degree of boldness and courage of the pioneers of air power to initiate, develop, articulate, and to effectively advocate for those air power, or aerospace, more properly termed, capabilities. We have a complex series of security challenges facing us today. I mentioned some of them earlier in my remarks. We are not going to be able to buy our way out of these challenges. The money simply isn't there anymore. Nor are there any silver bullet solutions. We're not going to be able to blast our way out of these problems with overwhelming force, as we no longer have the force structure we enjoyed in the past. We are going to have to think our way out of these problems, and to succeed, we need to exploit one of our greatest asymmetric advantages, and that's the brains of airmen, Air Force airmen in particular. Our respective nations' airmen need to expand their vision, understanding, and knowledge of all things Air Force, but most importantly, to completely understand the fundamentals of why air forces exist as independent air forces, educate others as to the potential that air power offers, fight for a seat at the table where force employment options are decided, and strongly advocate for air power options where they're most appropriate. Unfortunately, the record of the last 2 decades is not positive with respect to any of these 4 elements. The reasons are complex and beyond the scope of my presentation today, but here are a couple to consider. First, an incorrect understanding and application of jointness. Now, in honesty, many of what the examples I'm talking about here today are by virtue of the fact that I'm from the United States, extend from the United States, but I think some of you will understand them. Since the 1986 passage of the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the United States, a joint approach was supposed to move contingency organizations and operations from independent, deconflicted, service-oriented approaches to sustained interoperability. How well militaries have done that, where we are today, and where we ought to be heading could and should be a subject of a conference all of its own. But suffice it to say, the degree of jointness exhibited since 1986 has ebbed and flowed based on the commanders in charge. Leadership matters. And the degree, or lack thereof, that senior-most military leadership encouraged joint organization and execution. The rationale and purpose of jointness is well-intentioned and optimizes the use of service component forces, but only if it's properly understood and defined. I would tell you that jointness means that among our separate services, a distinctly developed and highly specialized array of capabilities is provided through service or functional components to a joint or combined force commander. His or her job is to assemble a plan from among this menu of capabilities, applying the appropriate ones for the contingency at hand and understanding that each contingency is going to be different. It does not mean that separate services deploy to a fight and simply align under a single commander. Nor does jointness mean everybody necessarily gets an equal share of the action. Jointness is recognizing that to be joint, we require separate services, and that it's an imperative that service members understand how to best exploit the advantages of operating in their domains. Articulating the virtues and values of your service is being joint, whether you're from the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. Jointness is not homogeneity. It is not going along to get along. It is recognizing that to be joint, we require separate and distinct services, and that it's crucial that leadership understands how to best exploit the advantages of operating in these individual domains. The reason joint or combined force operations create synergies is because this approach capitalizes on each service's core functions, functions that require much time, effort, and focus to develop the competencies required to exploit operations in their respective domains. There are many leaders out there that don't understand, by the way, I'm mainly speaking of politicians here, Congress in the case of the United States, that to have jointness, the separateness of the services is a requirement. It takes 25 years to hone the expertise to be a great division commander on the ground, a battle group commander at sea, or a joint force air component commander. The construct of joint operations require that we have strong and competent armies, navies, and air forces. However, to capitalize on the potential of the true value of jointness, air forces need to have a seat at the table in option development, planning, and execution, the command of forces and organizations where it's most appropriate. These conditions have suffered over the past quarter of a century, at least in the United States, and they need to be corrected. To understand the state of affairs in this regard, there was a lack of real joint force organization in Iraq or Afghanistan. More often than not, a J was simply put in front of an Army organization, and that was it. Joint Task Force Mountain, for example, in Afghanistan, had only Army personnel assigned. There was a multinational corps in Iraq, but there was no combined or joint task force in Iraq. In Afghanistan, there was an International Security Assistance Force, and there were U.S. forces Afghanistan, but there was never a combined or joint task force in Afghanistan with associated service components. This absence of real jointness in the first decade of the 21st century has continued into the second and manifests itself in the current organizational structure of Operation Inherent Resolve, the name of the effort to eliminate the Islamic State in Syria. Since that operation started in 2014, the predominant force involved in combat operations, with the exception of a small number of special operations forces until the last year, was air power. However, the commander of Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve has been an Army Corps commander for the last 6 iterations. The Army Central Command commander would not put an Army division commander in charge of a Navy aircraft carrier battle group, but yet has no problem with putting an Armor Corps commander in charge of an air campaign. Perhaps if there was an airman in charge, the air operations against the Islamic State would have been designed as an air campaign against a state, rather, or proto-state, rather than as a continuation of the counterinsurgency campaigns of Afghanistan and Iraq that were the experience of the Army commanders in charge. Perhaps then the Islamic State would have been nullified in 4 months instead of taking 4 years. Completing that operation rapidly, we would not have given the Islamic State the gift of time over 4 years to perpetuate their ideology of evil and spread it to over 30 additional countries, or time to migrate terrorists out of Syria, or time to commit the slaughter of innocent men, women, and children in the region. The Army-dominated Central Command leadership is on the record many times saying that this would take a long time. But that's how armies think, because they generally move at the speed of infantry, single-digit miles per hour. It takes a division commander in the Army 25 years to master the terrain that a lieutenant in the Air Force flies over in 90 seconds. Think about that and its implications for operational approaches to campaign design. Every service leader has a moral obligation to think of the best way they can achieve desired effects in support of desired national or coalition aims. Top leaders can then assess which option is favorable. But when a service surrenders their voice in this process, they may be putting a nation or coalition at risk and putting lives unnecessarily in danger if their approach, which may have never gotten to the senior level decision makers, was actually a better option that could secure objectives and save coalition lives. Back in 1930, Billy Mitchell succinctly stated, quote, "The advent of air power, which can go straight to the vital centers and entirely neutralize or destroy them, has put a completely new complexion on the old system of making war," unquote. Who offered the alternative of rapidly terminating the Islamic State's ability to effectively function by rapidly crushing them in Syria as a first priority, as opposed to rebuilding the Iraqi army and then assisting it in regaining lost ground in Iraq? I offer that in Operation Inherent Resolve, the latter could have been accomplished much quicker if an air-based strategy against the Islamic State in Syria was selected over the ground-based strategy applied that treated air power as simply aerial artillery. In the interwar years of the 20s and the 30s, airmen pioneered aviation technology, then devised concepts of operation around the potential of that technology, and followed that up with associated air power doctrine. The value of this progression of technology, concepts, and doctrine was seen in the World War II post-war strategic bombing survey assessment, which concluded that the air campaign was a decisive factor in securing the Allies' victory over Germany. Thank goodness, airmen of the time articulated and fought for that option. We need that same kind of boldness today. We should also be very mindful that a generation of occupation-based, ground-centric strategies seeking to win hearts and minds that have different perspectives and trying to turn 16th century tribes into modern democracies has created a dearth of articulate air power practitioners and advocates in the ranks of our armed services. Airmen of the past 2 decades have been lured into a mold of compliance and silence. Compounding that compliance in the United States was when Air Force leaders in the first decade of the 21st century did advocate for a strong Air Force. They were promptly removed from office. The failure at the strategic level of the last nearly 2 decades of ground-centric doctrine in multiple iterations should have lit a fire in the air power community. Airmen should have been striving to seek optimal alternatives. However, airmen articulating alternative options have been missing. I believe that can be attributed to a fundamental misunderstanding of jointness, as I described above. If we're going to optimally exploit the virtues and values of air power to meet the challenges of the future, our security establishments need a proper understanding of why independent air forces exist, a proper grasp of jointness, and a sense of air-mindedness that all Air Force members should embrace as a foundation of their being. Airmen need to think like architects, not bricklayers. They need to relate to bringing vigilance, reach, and power to whatever task they are given, not just to offer alternative weapon systems to attrit an adversary. Okay, let me wrap up my remarks. The challenge before us is to transform today to dominate an operational environment that is rapidly evolving and to counter adversaries who are rapidly advancing in capability. In the face of disruptive innovation and cultural change, the military can maintain the status quo, or it can embrace and exploit change. As you might have already figured out, I suggest that the latter is preferred. Our services need to learn better how to adapt new technology to the innovative concepts of operation that technology allows. Our intelligence communities, military, and other security institutions will suffer if their internal organizations fail to adapt to new disruptive innovations and concepts. Just as combat tomorrow will look different than it did yesterday, so too should the military with which we prosecute it. We should take maximum advantage of the asymmetric capabilities our nations possess with their air forces, operating in conjunction with their land and maritime forces in innovative ways. A concerted focus on further developing and expanding air power capabilities will serve our allied nations well, as they are uniquely positioned to underpin the kind of defense strategy appropriate for the future. Airmen embrace the ability to rise above the constraints of terrain, literally, and to transcend the strictures of a horizontal perspective. As air power perspectives moved into space, a theory of the indivisibility of aerospace power materialized as the technologies of air and space merged in application. By the end of the 20th century, the evolved combination of air and space technologies enabled great accuracy and assured access from aerospace systems. This combination yielded a concept of operations to achieve control over an enemy's essential systems, no longer defined simply by just levels of destruction. Rather, by imposing very specific effects on an adversary from means employed from airspace and cyber, air power can effectively impose strategic control over the outcome of a conflict. It's a methodology that realizes an adversary's ability to operate as desired is ultimately as important, if not more so, than the destruction of the forces it relies upon for subjugation. This effects-based or outcome-driven approach to warfare expands the options for the conduct of warfare beyond attrition and annihilation-based models that define surface warfare. Air power going forward holds the potential to accelerate and amplify this kind of approach. So thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. I hope I didn't speak too fast, and I look forward with engaging you later on today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roman.
Thank you very much, General, for this amazingly rich presentation and keynote. I think that we could perhaps, I have a question for you just after this presentation. That's not about air power, if you please, but because I was really interested in one thing. I just have a question on the Mitchell Institute. It is named after Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell was a kind of a provocative officer, a maverick in a way, not really fully appreciated by some of other officers in the United States at this time. Your institute is named after Billy Mitchell. Do you need that it is needed to be provocative, to be a maverick, to really think strategically today?
First, yes, he was provocative. A matter of fact, if you actually go back and read and understand a bit of the history of General Billy Mitchell, he was really actually obnoxious. But he had to be at that particular point in time. While we're named after him, we're trying to do our very best not to be obnoxious. But yet, be able to articulate new and innovative concepts. There is a technique. You want to be forward-leaning, but you can't be so far out that your ideas are not pragmatic, because they won't be accepted. So I think that we have walked that line pretty well over the last 6 years in getting new ideas out there, in partnering with our Air Force. We're very close to the leadership of our Air Force. But what's different between what actual military services can do, at least in our country, and what the Mitchell Institute can do, is when you're in, having been a military officer in the Air Force, senior officer for 35 years, you are constrained resource-wise by the administration's budget. You see, so there are, but as a nonprofit organization, we're not constrained by the budget. So we can speak to the principles and the utility and the importance and the value of particular areas of interest that while you're in the service, you might not be able to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
You know, you'll hear me talk. I've talked about it for 10 years now. The fact that the United States Air Force is under-resourced for the mission that's been accomplished or expected of them. We have a geriatric U.S. Air Force. The youngest B-52 is 55 years old. We have training aircraft, the T-38s, that are over 50 years old. Our average age is 28 years. That's everything, including the newest C-17s, the newest F-35s. F-22s are 10 years old now. But it still continues to grow. So one of the things that we can do at Mitchell is continue to advocate to our Congress and the American public that the Air Force is under-resourced and underfunded. And now you see it with space. You know, just this week, and sorry for the long answer, but you asked the question, so I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity. I mean, just this past week, our Congress authorized a new service, U.S. Space Force. Did it come with any additional resources? No. A matter of fact, it specifically said no more money. You just take what the Air Force has given you. Do we get more people? No. You're limited to the number of people. Did we get anybody from any of the other service components that work space issues? No. Did we get any of the other 60 organizations in the U.S. government that have a hand in space? No. Then what are we doing? Anyway, I don't have any strong passion on that subject, but so we can advocate for, you want to increase capabilities in space, you can't do it for nothing. I'm sorry, but again, that's what the difference is between Mitchell Institute and some military organization.
You have passion on the space question and also on the ground question, and I deeply regret that there is here with us no officers from the army, because that could have been really interesting.
Well, I say the same thing with them here too. Like I said, I believe in the necessity for strong armies and strong navies. But we've seen the results of their kinds of approaches and doctrine and strategies toward the employment of military force over the last 20 years. It's not a very good outcome.
I'm sure we will have a lot of questions, perhaps, but after a pause and the coffee for all. Thank you again, General, for this keynote. Thank you. And je vous invite à prendre une petite pause. On reprendra les questions après, au cours, je suis sûr qu'il y en aura beaucoup, au cours du premier panel. Le café nous attend pour un quart d'heure de... Merci d'être de retour dans cet amphithéâtre. Donc, nous venons d'avoir une présentation extrêmement riche. Vous l'avez noté, ce n'était pas seulement à propos du multidomaine ou de la Mosaic Warfare, mais on est allé, avec le général Deptula, je le remercie beaucoup, bien au-delà. On est sur une réflexion sur les équilibres de la pensée stratégique, hein, bien au-delà de l'air power, simplement. Et je crois qu'il serait intéressant, éventuellement, avant que le premier panel ne commence, de prendre un peu le temps, merci mon général d'avoir accepté, de prendre 2 questions assez rapides pour pouvoir finir en beauté cette séquence et passer au premier panel. David Deptula est avec nous aujourd'hui, donc vous pourrez continuer à dialoguer avec lui, et puis au cours des panels, on pourra échanger par ailleurs. Alors, je vais prendre 2 questions. Mon général.
No, that's good.
Yeah. And it's okay.
Thank you very much, General. So I'm General Chollet. I'm now in the office of the French Air Force Chief of Staff, but from July 2016 to July 2017, I was the commander of Operation Chamal. Operation Chamal is the French part of the Operation Inherent Resolve. And I was under the command of an army general, an army 3-star general, but a very, very, very good general. So you can be an army guy and be an excellent one.
Yeah.
Definitely. No. But my question is, you are right. The 3-star level command of Operation Inherent Resolve was the 3rd Corps Army of the 18th Corps Army. But why the US Air Force couldn't impose a 3-star Air Force guy to take a command in the round of this? And my position is probably it's your fault, I mean the US Air Force, because maybe you have some complex and you don't want to take this level of responsibility, or maybe because you don't have this, I mean, the manpower to take this responsibility of the operational level. What's your position, please?
First, thank you very much for the question. It is an excellent question, and I do not disagree with your premise. I hope you noticed in some of the tail end of my remarks, I was asking about where are the air power voices. First, the answer to your question is a complex one. There has been, and I will be frank with you. I'm known for my frankness.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
When the Secretary of Defense removed our Chief of Staff, General Mosley, and the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary Mike Wynn, in 2008, that had, and I'm sure it was not in Secretary Gates's mind malicious intent to this degree, but the impact on people's ability or desire to advocate for particular positions, that was like throwing a glass of cold water on them. Okay, so it sent the unintended message of you better not speak truth to power unless you know what the power wants. All right, and it created and it began a culture inside of our Air Force of going along to get along. All right, so this was it's not an easy answer, because it's one that's very, very complex. I talked about how leadership matters, personalities matter. And there was a general feeling inside the leadership of the Air Force Now this is my interpretation of the issue, that we should not push for that position. And the senior leadership of the Air Force at the time acquiesced to an Army Joint Task Force commander. I think it was wrong, the wrong choice. An airman should have been in charge. I mean, I made the comment, the commander of CENTCOM's not going to put an Army Major General in charge of an aircraft carrier battle group. Or if you imagine a land force operation that consisted only of armor, you wouldn't put an Air Force 3-star in charge of that. So why'd you put an Armor Corps commander or airborne or infantry? They've been all branches who were in charge of essentially what was an air campaign. I understand there was a ground force element. Okay, so you have an airman in charge and you have a 2-star deputy that works the ground force operations. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, it brings a different perspective. So it's a complex answer, but you're correct. The Air Force could have made an issue of it, but they elected not to. What else?
Thank you. Last question here. Yep. Oh.
Can do that, Mac. Thank you, sir. I'm David Papalardo from the French Air Force Transformation Branch and Capability Branch. Sorry. I will take
No, I can hear you.
The rest of the audience.
Okay. So thank you, sir, for your intervention. I'm David Papalardo, working at the Air Capability Branch in central headquarters in Paris. So you mentioned a lot narrow parochialism as a challenge to overcome if we want to implement correctly multi-domain operation. Short story, 1 year ago, I was lucky enough to attend to a panel at the Air University at Maxwell, and we are top of G3 of each services, Air Force, Navy, and all the yada yada. And it was quite funny enough because eventually they argue that much on their differences, different standing point on multi-domain operation, that everyone in the room, how could we succeed in such an operation implementing multi-domain? Every service has its own view. Here is my question. I had the sensation, John, in the United States, the USAF is particularly focusing on fluid domains, cyber, of course, space, and the classical air power, I would say. Don't you think that if we want to get the Army with us in an actual multi-domain operation mindset, we should not forget air surface integration, at least in France, for example. I realized that after big efforts for air surface integration, we tend to forget it, and it could impede us to implement correct multi-domain operations. So what do you think about air surface integration, sir?
It's an excellent question. Thank you very much. I think the whole issue of air and surface integration is one that is now very well ensconced in U.S. joint doctrine. And I mean, you don't hear, a matter of fact, almost too well. Now, what I mean by too well is that there are advocates and people out there that say, well, you can't use air power without somebody on the ground telling you what's going on and how to use it. I think that's going too far. I don't think there's a problem. I really don't. I think it is, people understand that this partnership between surface and air forces is one that works very, very well. My concern is there's still this notion that air is simply in support of surface forces. What I'm trying to argue for in moving toward greater multi-domain operations is the acknowledgement that if you can get out of this mindset of, look, I'm the ground commander, you all do what I say, and actually accept a joint proposition, there may be instances where you'll maneuver ground forces in response to what air power can bring to bear. This is what we did in the early stages in Afghanistan. I mean, think about it. The Northern Alliance had been fighting the Taliban for over 5 years and had not achieved any objectives. What happened? We brought air power to bear and then worked in conjunction with surface forces to create desired outcomes or effects. It's a different way of thinking about how you combine forces. But to wrap up, I don't think that anyone's forgotten about the synergy that accrues from air-to-surface integration. Were we going to take one more, or you got ready to go to panel?
Just one, really,
Sure.
one last, because we have someone here who was part of Inherent Resolve. So he has a question,
Sure.
really quick, and
I'll
we
try
will,
to-
yeah.
I'll try to give a short answer.
For you.
All right, I'll try to do a short answer.
Micro, yeah.
Thank you. I was part of Inherent Resolve as the Canadian Joint Task Force in 2015-16 as an infantry officer. So I am curious, how could you have solved the conflict in 4 months rather than 4 years if the operation would have been Air Force oriented, like you said previously, sir?
Okay, great question. Short answer. Solved may be something that we talk about in terms of a definition. But what I would suggest that the strategy that was employed was 180 degrees opposite of what I would have advocated for. In other words, instead of building up the confidence and ability of the Iraqi forces to expel the Islamic State forces from Iraq as a first priority, I would have focused on disestablishing the ability of the Islamic State to operate as a coherent force by eliminating their key elements that allowed them to operate out of Raqqa and to continue to export their ideology by completely eliminating their leadership, their key essential systems, the oil distribution system that they relied upon for income, by going directly first against their leadership and locus of power in Raqqa first, and then worried about getting rid of, or let the Iraqis, quite frankly, worry about expelling the elements of the Islamic State from Mosul and elements in Iraq. I'd make that the secondary priority. So, you know, it is what it is, and we can't go back, but that is an alternative, and that's what I would have recommended. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, General, again, for those views